Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Abo Natural Processed Ethiopia from The Real Bean. And there's the bag right there. And The Real Bean, based out of Seoul, Korea. And once again, they were a suggestion to us by Jeff Park. So once again, a shout out to and thank you to Jeff for the suggestion. This is The Real Bean's second ever appearance on this channel, having previously reviewed the Edward Sandoval, a wash-processed Colombian coffee. And when reviewing a brand new coffee roaster for the first time, we usually like to review one of their washed and one of their non-washed offerings, with this coffee acting as the non-washed representative. So you'll see how this coffee turned out, as this right here is day 43. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe, at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this coffee, once again, it is in line with our previous experiences with this coffee roaster, which was on the notably more developed side of things, as this one I feel like a lot of people would align with being either a true medium or on the slightly lighter side of that medium, or on the notably more developed side of that medium light by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 17, first impression, and we did opt for the V60, and the coffee itself was surprisingly clean and intense in a fruit sense, with a mostly tropical and stone fruit aspect to the coffee. The development was felt with plenty of robustness, otherwise it did leave an interesting first impression. Day 20 through the Chemex, and the coffee is still skewing on the cleaner side of things with plenty of the tropical fruit intensity yet again. The berry aspect is a slight bit heavier, as well as the tropical aspects having a slightly heavier syrupiness to them as well. In addition to that, there's that slightly robust quality, as there's certainly a notable bit of development this time around as well. But once again, these first two experiences have been a little bit better than expected, given that the first coffee we had was at Edward Sandoval. So this one, being the second impression of this coffee roaster, was definitely notably more prominent and improved than that first try. Day 23 through the April brewer, and there was a little difference on this day, as the entirety does continue to remain slightly hindered by the overall development to this one, but there was plenty of backing tropicals to kind of counteract that notably more robust and smoky quality to it. Pretty heavy yet again, so once again in line with the expectations for a natural processed coffee. We move on to day 26, as we opted for the V60 with some lower extraction adjustments, lower temperature, and a higher concentration. And it's a bit better, as the coffee does feel a little bit cleaner, mostly prominent in the stone fruit sense yet again, this time pretty candied, so better overall this time around. Day 29 through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and there's some struggles to this coffee, especially within this brew method, as it's offering a combination of heaviness and robustness and a much more pronounced berry aspect this time around. The coffee has been pretty consistent so far, with plenty of the heavier tropical nectar aspects to it, but this time I would say it was skewing a little less in terms of the overall cleanliness to it. Day 32 through the V60 with our standard recipe, and interestingly, this is the best the coffee had been up to this point, as it's leaned a little bit more into the natural aspects, as there's much more of the heaviness and fermentiness to it. However, the prominent berry aspects and the development also still hindering the cup, it didn't necessarily impact the overall results of it too bad, as I would say that there was a slight bit more cleanliness and definition to the overall profile within this coffee. Day 35 through the Chemex with our standard recipe, and there were more struggles, especially within this brew method, and I felt like it really didn't seem to have a good result within the Chemex, as there was notably more harshness that seemed to hinder the overall experience, as it's heavier and more fermenty, especially with a prominent bit of roastiness as well. Perfumey florals and heavy grape aspects with a bit of the red fruit and heavy tropical nectar yet again. Day 38, final notes we have through the V60 with our standard recipe, and this was the best that had been up to this point, as it's relatively more even and clean, especially considering some of the earlier days that we did have pretty well-defined berry and perfumey floral tones, complemented by some sweeter citric aspects and some slightly cleaner sugary stone fruit qualities as well. Nowhere near as heavy, and as a result, it was notably better than a lot of those other days. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. We have a handful of level 4s. So let's go through those, and we'll start with the finish, level 4. And I think we'll actually discuss the finish and the sweetness at a level 4 together, mostly because, as I always say, when it comes to more processed coffees, if either of those do skew too heavily in one direction, then it can kind of throw the coffee off in general. But in this case, it did have a little bit more of an evenness to it. And just kind of taking a look at this tasting wheel, this coffee does look pretty even and balanced, especially relative to the Edward Sandoval, as I feel like there isn't anything that's skewing too heavily in one direction or the other direction. So this coffee actually has some really nice balance to it, and I think that's echoed by the overall sweetness and finish to this coffee, as it does have plenty of the more tropical nectar-like aspects within the sweetness and the finish to it, as that seems to be the most lingering component to it. So I'm actually happy with both those scoring there at that level 4 mark. Florality at level 4, and I think that they do have something along the lines of perfume or perfuminess, but yeah, there's definitely that kind of lingering, strong perfumey florality to it. A lot of people describe it as being violet, but a little bit more dark in those floral components to them. Berry fruit, level 4, and this one had a bit more of a red fruit tone to it, which is fully expected for a natural processed Ethiopian coffee. I was just happy that it didn't skew too heavily within that direction, as it's there, it's prominent, and you can certainly feel it within this coffee, but it does come out a bit more even without skewing in the overbearing sense. Citrus fruit, level 4, and I can certainly feel a little bit more of that sweeter citric quality to it, thinking a little bit more along the lines of an orange quality. So I was actually quite happy with the citrus being a little bit more sweet as opposed to in the Edward Sandoval, which was a little bit too, I would say, bitter. Stone fruit, level 4, and if I recall correctly, I think that they have something along the lines of a peach note listed on here. I think that they also have a little bit more of a sugary stone fruit, something along the lines of a mango. But for me, given that it is in a bit more of a concentrated, heavier nectar-like sense to it, I'm thinking a lot more of those syrupy, strong mango-like components to this one. And I would say, if anything, that's actually the most abundant and dominant quality within this coffee. So level 4, definitely the best place to put it for me. We move on to the level 3s. We will start with the acidity level 3. That's a bit of a contrasting characteristic relative to the G-Rosso that we've also reviewed from this coffee roaster. And I feel like that's probably a bit more in line with my expectations for this coffee roaster. This one's also a natural processed Ethiopian coffee, so it usually is going to skew in that direction for the most part. So having it scored there at that level 3, a little bit more of a moderate level of the brightness on this one. Body level 3, definitely has still a fair bit of texture within this one, as I feel like given the overall profile of the coffees from this coffee roaster, you're definitely going to have a fair bit of body and texture to the coffees from them. And then the final and most important thing we're discussing within this tasting wheel, and that is the cleanliness level 3. So this one's equally as clean as the Edward Sandoval, and if anything, I would say that it's actually a little bit cleaner, given that it was just overall cleaner than the average natural processed Ethiopian coffee these days, though we've had some really nice and clean Ethiopian coffees this past year. So it did still skew heavier in that sense, a little bit cleaner, and it's going to be hindered by the overall development to it. As you can see, the smokiness is there at the level 2, and then there's a fair bit of fermentiness to it. But on that final day, I said, you know, this is clean enough that it's, I would say, significantly cleaner, like almost a full point cleaner than the Edward Sandoval, because it's not dragged down by the same roasty, smoky quality to it. It's there, but not to the same extent where it seems to just take away from the overall definition of the profile within this coffee. As if anything, I could say that a lot of the aspects within this one were pretty well defined, especially a lot of the floral and fruit qualities to it. So I'm actually quite happy with where it scored there at that level 3 mark. So as I am looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I did say in our review of the Edward Sandoval that usually when it comes to a coffee that isn't in line with my own preferences for the profile, I usually like to try to find some silver lining with the coffee. And that's the case with this one, as it once again isn't in line with my own preferences. It is notably too developed for what I usually like to drink. That being said, I found a lot of positives from this coffee, especially as it is a natural processed coffee, notably cleaner than I would have expected, and the fruit profiles weren't too overbearing and too intense. And this one, once again, is nicely even. It's very well balanced in a lot of ways, as even with lighter profiled coffees, they can skew a little bit too much in one direction, where this one right here, it stays between the level 2 and level 4 for everything within this, and the fruit profile is extremely balanced, as you get a level 4 for all of the fruit components, the floral components, the sweetness, and maybe if the clarity was a little better, then this one could have stood out a little bit more. But as far as a coffee in this category goes, I would say that this one was fine. Once again, it's not necessarily going to be my own type of thing. This isn't necessarily a profile that I would usually gravitate towards, but for what it is, I think that this coffee is actually pretty decent. type of person I would suggest this coffee to. I'm definitely going to keep the profile of this one in mind, as once again, these coffees do tend to have a fair bit more traditionality to them, especially within the overall profile to them, being on the more developed side of things. So let's start with that. Outside of that, this one does have a fair bit of the more modern natural characteristics to it, which is to say that it's not necessarily the cleanest, but you are getting a fair bit of the heavier tropical nectar qualities as well as those red fruit qualities to it to kind of put it together with that profile and a little bit more body. I feel like that's the best direction I can point somebody towards on this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Abo Natural Processed Ethiopia from The Real Bean. Thank you for watching.